I wasn't supposed to be the bride that night. The words echoed in my head as I stared at my reflection, my fingers frozen against the smooth fabric of a wedding dress that didn't belong to me, a dress tailored for someone else's life, someone else's future, someone who had already run far enough away to leave me standing in her place. The room smelled faintly of roses and something colder, something expensive, like money that didn't ask questions, and I could hear the distant hum of voices downstairs, low and controlled, the kind of voices that didn't belong to normal people with normal lives. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, trying to recognize the girl staring back at me, but she looked like a stranger, pale skin, wide eyes, shoulders too stiff, like if I moved too fast, the whole illusion would shatter and someone would finally admit this was a mistake. But no one was coming to stop it. No one ever did. "You should be grateful," my stepmother had said just an hour ago, her voice sharp and polished, like glass that never cracked. "Do you understand what kind of life this gives you?" I understood more than she thought. I understood that this wasn't a gift. It was a trade. And I was the currency. My stepsister had disappeared sometime before dawn, no goodbye, no explanation, just an empty room and a silence that spread through the house like a storm rolling in, and by noon, they had already decided what to do with me. Replace her. Fix the problem. Keep the deal intact. It didn't matter that I said no. It didn't matter that my hands shook when they pushed the papers in front of me, that my voice cracked when I asked if there was another way. There wasn't. There never was. Because the man waiting downstairs wasn't someone you negotiated with. He was someone you obeyed. I pressed my palm against the mirror, feeling the cool glass, grounding myself for a second that felt too short, because the knock came right on time, 3 quiet taps that somehow carried more weight than a shout. "It's time," a voice said through the door, calm, professional, like this was just another event on a schedule. Like I wasn't about to walk into a life I didn't choose. My heart pounded harder as I turned away from the mirror, each step toward the door heavier than the last, like the floor itself was trying to hold me back, but I kept moving anyway, because stopping wouldn't change anything. It never had. When the door opened, the hallway stretched out in front of me, long and dim, lined with soft golden lights that made everything look softer than it really was, and at the far end, I could already see the staircase leading down to him. I hadn't met him yet, not properly, not face to face, but I knew enough. Everyone did. 65 years old. A name that made people lower their voices. A man who didn't need to raise his hand to be heard. A man who didn't lose control because he never gave it away in the first place. Victor Moretti. My husband. The word didn't feel real. It didn't feel like mine. I rested my hand on the railing at the top of the stairs, my breath catching as I finally saw him below, standing still among a room full of people who all seemed to orbit around him without getting too close, his posture straight, his presence quiet but absolute, like gravity you couldn't escape. He didn't look up right away. He didn't need to. When he finally did, his eyes met mine across the distance, dark and unreadable, and something in my chest tightened, not fear exactly, but something sharper, something that refused to bend. In that moment, I realized something no one else had bothered to consider. They thought I would break. They thought I would disappear into this life like it was already written. But they were wrong. Because I wasn't my stepsister. And I wasn't walking down those stairs to surrender. I was walking down to change the rules. I felt every step before I took it, the weight of the dress pulling at my shoulders, the quiet murmur of voices below growing sharper as I began to descend, each inch closing the distance between the life I had known and the one I had been forced into, and still, I did not look away from him, not even for a second, because something in me refused to lower my gaze first. The room shifted when I reached the last step, not loudly, not dramatically, just a subtle tightening of attention, like the air itself was waiting to see what I would do next, and for a moment, no one spoke, no one moved, until a man in a perfectly tailored suit stepped forward with a polite smile that did not reach his eyes and gestured toward a table covered in documents and a single pen placed carefully in the center. "Miss Carter," he said, his tone smooth, practiced, if you would just sign here, we can proceed. Proceed, like this was a meeting, like this was business, like I was not about to bind myself to a man I had never chosen. My fingers curled slightly at my sides, but I did not move toward the table, not yet, and I could feel it, the shift in attention again, sharper this time, like a ripple through the room, because hesitation was not something they expected from me. I turned my head just enough to glance at my stepmother, standing a few feet away, her expression tight, her eyes warning me without a single word, and beside her, my stepsister's absence felt louder than anything she could have said if she had stayed. Emily, my stepmother whispered, barely moving her lips, do not make this worse. Worse. The word settled in my chest, heavy and familiar, because worse was always what they promised when I did not comply, worse for my father, worse for the house, worse for everything that depended on my silence, and for a second, I almost stepped forward, almost reached for the pen, almost let it happen the way they wanted. Almost. Then I looked back at him. Victor Moretti had not moved from where he stood, his posture unchanged, his expression unreadable, but his eyes were on me, steady and patient in a way that felt more dangerous than anger, like he had already accounted for every possible outcome and none of them surprised him. He did not rush me. He did not speak. He simply waited. And that was when I understood something else they had not considered. This was not just about obedience. This was about control. And control, once given, was almost impossible to take back. I walked toward the table slowly, aware of every step, every breath, every pair of eyes following me, until I stood in front of the documents that would decide everything, the paper crisp and clean. The lines already prepared, my name printed neatly beside his as if it had always belonged there. My hand hovered over the pen, close enough to feel the cool metal without touching it, and for a moment, the room felt too quiet, too still, like the world had paused just long enough for me to choose who I was going to be. I picked up the pen. A small movement, barely noticeable, but it shifted something, I could feel it, the tension easing just slightly, the expectation settling back into place, because this was the part where I was supposed to comply, where I was supposed to follow the script they had written for me. I lowered the tip of the pen to the paper, my fingers steady now, steadier than I expected, and I signed my name in one clean motion, the ink dark against the white page, final and undeniable. A breath moved through the room, soft but collective, like a decision had just been confirmed, like everything was now exactly as it should be. I placed the pen back down carefully, aligning it with the edge of the table, my movements precise, controlled, and then I looked up again, straight at him, holding his gaze without flinching, without hesitation, because I needed him to see it, needed him to understand that what had just happened was not what everyone else believed it to be. They thought I had given in. They thought I had accepted my place. But as the man beside me reached for the documents and began speaking about formalities I did not hear, as my stepmother finally allowed herself to relax, as the room resumed its quiet rhythm, I realized something that made my pulse steady instead of race. I had not just signed away my freedom. I had stepped into his world. And I had done it on my own terms. The moment the ink dried, everything changed, not in a loud or obvious way, but in the subtle shift of how people looked at me, how they moved around me, how space itself seemed to rearrange as if I had stepped into a role that carried weight I had not fully measured yet, and before I could process it, the man who had been standing beside the table cleared his throat and announced in a steady voice that the agreement was now official, that all terms would proceed as arranged, words that sounded clinical, distant, like they belonged in a contract rather than a life. I barely heard him. My focus stayed on Victor Moretti. He moved then, finally, closing the distance between us with slow, deliberate steps, the kind that did not need to rush because nothing ever stood in their way, and when he stopped in front of me, close enough that I could see the faint lines at the corners of his eyes, the quiet precision in the way he carried himself, I realized that nothing about him was careless, not his posture, not his silence, not even the way he studied me now as if reassessing something he thought he already understood. Emily Carter, he said, my name low and measured, like he was testing how it fit in his world, and I felt the sound of it settle differently than it ever had before, heavier, more deliberate. You understand what this means? It was not a question. It was an expectation. I held his gaze, steady, refusing to let the weight of the room press me into something smaller. It means the contract is complete, I said, my voice even, controlled in a way that surprised me, and for the first time since I had walked down those stairs, something shifted in his expression, not much, just the slightest pause, like I had answered a question he had not fully asked. Around us, the room resumed its quiet motion, conversations restarting in low tones, footsteps soft against polished floors, but it all felt distant, like background noise fading behind something sharper, more focused. Victor glanced briefly toward the man holding the documents, a silent signal that was immediately understood, and within seconds, the papers were gathered, the witnesses dismissed, the formalities concluded with efficient precision, leaving only the two of us standing in a space that suddenly felt larger than before. "We are leaving," he said, turning his attention back to me, not commanding, not raised, just stated, like the next step had already been decided long before I arrived. I did not move right away. Not out of defiance, not exactly, but because I needed one more second to anchor myself, to recognize that the life behind me had already begun to close, piece by piece, without asking if I was ready. My stepmother avoided my eyes as I glanced in her direction, her relief more obvious than anything else, and in that moment, I understood that whatever happened next, I would not be coming back to that house the same way I had left it. If I came back at all. I turned back to Victor and gave a small nod, not submissive, not hesitant, just enough to acknowledge that I was moving forward because I chose to, not because I had been pushed. He noticed. I could tell by the way his gaze lingered half a second longer than before, like he was marking the difference. We walked side by side toward the exit, his presence drawing a quiet path through the room, people stepping aside without being asked, their attention carefully controlled, respectful without being obvious, and I stayed in step with him, matching his pace without falling behind, without trying to catch up, because I was not following him. I was walking with him. Outside, the night air felt cooler than I expected, a sharp contrast to the warmth of the room we had just left, and the black car waiting at the curb looked exactly like what it was, not transportation, but transition, a line between two worlds that did not overlap. The driver opened the door without a word, and Victor paused just long enough to let me enter first, a gesture that could have been courtesy or calculation, I was not sure yet, and as I stepped inside, the leather seat cool beneath my hands, I realized something that settled deep in my chest, steady and unshaken. This was the moment everything was supposed to be taken from me. My choice. My control. My voice. But as the door closed and the city lights blurred beyond the tinted glass, I understood that they had made one critical mistake. They thought I had been forced into this. They thought I had no power here. And Victor Moretti, for all his control, had just allowed me into his world without asking what I intended to do once I was inside. The car door closed with a quiet, final sound that felt louder than it should have, sealing me inside a space that smelled faintly of leather and something darker, something controlled, and for a moment I just sat there, my hands resting lightly in my lap, feeling the subtle vibration of the engine as it came to life, the world outside already beginning to move without waiting for me to catch up. Victor slid in beside me without a word, his presence filling the space without effort, like the air adjusted around him automatically, and when the car pulled away from the curb, smooth and precise, I realized there would be no dramatic moment, no speech, no explanation of what came next. This was how his world worked. Things simply happened. I turned my head slightly, watching the city lights stretch into long reflections against the tinted glass, familiar streets becoming distant in a matter of seconds, and I wondered how far we were going, not in miles, but in meaning, how far this single decision would take me from everything I had known. "You are quiet," Victor said after a while, his voice low, even, not intrusive, just observant, like he was noting a detail rather than asking a question. I let a small breath out, steadying myself before I answered. "There is not much to say," I replied, my voice calm, because panic would not help me here, and silence would not protect me either. He did not respond immediately, and I could feel his attention shift toward me, not aggressively, not sharply, just present, like a weight you could not ignore even if you tried. Most people would disagree, he said finally, his tone carrying the faintest trace of something I could not quite place, not amusement, not irritation, something quieter. I turned then, meeting his gaze fully for the first time in this confined space, noticing how still he was, how controlled, like every reaction passed through a filter before it reached the surface. Most people are not in this situation, I said, holding his eyes without hesitation, and there it was again, that pause, that slight shift in his expression that told me he had expected something else, something softer, something easier to manage. The car slowed as we turned onto a longer, quieter road, the city noise fading behind us, replaced by a kind of silence that felt deliberate, like even the environment was chosen to match his world. You signed without hesitation, he said, not looking away, his words measured, careful. But you are not afraid. It was not a question. It was an observation he was trying to confirm. I felt the weight of that statement settle between us, heavier than anything that had been said so far, because fear was expected, fear was predictable, fear was something he understood. I let a small, controlled smile touch my lips, not warm, not soft, just enough to acknowledge the truth without giving it away completely. You are wrong, I said quietly. I am afraid. His gaze sharpened slightly, not in aggression, but in focus, like he was adjusting something in his mind. Then why do you not act like it, he asked, and this time, it was a question, even if it did not sound like one. I looked away for a second, just long enough to gather the words I wanted, not the ones that came first, but the ones that mattered. Because fear does not mean I stop thinking, I said, turning back to him, my voice steady, deliberate. And it does not mean I stop choosing. The car came to a smooth stop in front of a tall iron gate, the kind that did not need decoration to make its purpose clear, and as it began to open slowly, revealing a long driveway beyond, I felt something settle inside me, something solid and unshaken. Victor did not speak again, but I could feel it, the shift, subtle but undeniable, like something about me had just moved from expectation to uncertainty in his mind, and uncertainty, I realized, was the one thing a man like him did not allow easily. As the car passed through the gates and the world outside disappeared behind us, I understood that this was no longer about survival. This was about position. And for the first time since this began, I was no longer the only one trying to figure out what came next. The car rolled to a slow, deliberate stop at the top of the drive, and for a moment, neither of us moved, the engine idling softly beneath us like a quiet reminder that everything was still in motion even when it felt suspended, and when the driver stepped out to open the door, the night air slipped in again, cooler. Now, sharper, carrying the faint scent of trimmed hedges and something older, something established, like this place had existed long before I ever stepped into it. I stepped out first, the gravel beneath my shoes barely making a sound, my eyes lifting instinctively to take in the house in front of me, if it could even be called a house, because it was larger than anything I had ever lived in, wide stone walls, tall windows glowing with soft golden light, every detail precise and intentional, not excessive, not loud, just undeniable in its presence, the kind of place that did not need to prove anything because it already knew what it was. Victor joined me a second later, closing the distance with the same controlled ease he carried everywhere, and for a brief moment, we stood side by side in silence, both looking at the same structure but seeing it differently, because to him, this was familiar, predictable, his world, while to me, it was something new, something I had to understand quickly if I intended to survive inside it. This is your home now, he said, his voice even, not possessive, not soft, just certain, and the word home settled differently than I expected, heavier than comfort, closer to responsibility. I did not answer right away. Instead, I let my gaze move across the details, the long steps leading to the entrance, the subtle presence of security I could feel more than see, the way everything here functioned without visible effort, and then I looked back at him, meeting his eyes with the same steadiness I had held since the moment I walked down those stairs earlier. Then I will need to understand how it works, I said, my tone calm, deliberate, and for a second, something almost like approval flickered beneath his expression before it disappeared just as quickly, replaced by that same composed neutrality. He gestured lightly toward the entrance, not commanding, not insisting, just indicating the direction, and I moved forward without hesitation, because standing still would not give me any answers. The doors opened before we reached them, quiet and precise, revealing a wide interior space that felt both warm and controlled at the same time. Polished floors, soft lighting, the faint echo of footsteps somewhere deeper inside, and as I stepped across the threshold, I felt it again, that subtle shift, like crossing an invisible line that separated everything I had been from everything I was about to become. A woman in a tailored uniform approached from the side, her posture straight, her expression respectful but unreadable, and she inclined her head slightly toward Victor before turning her attention to me. "Mrs. Moretti," she said, the title landing with a weight that felt unfamiliar, "your room has been prepared." I did not react immediately, not outwardly, even though the words echoed differently in my mind, because that name, that role, was still something I was learning how to carry without letting it define me completely. Victor glanced at me then, not to correct, not to interrupt, just to observe, and I realized he was watching how I would respond to this, how I would position myself within his world now that I was inside it. I straightened slightly, not in submission, but in clarity, and gave a small nod. "Thank you," I said, my voice even, controlled, and the woman stepped aside immediately, as if that was all the confirmation she needed. Victor remained where he was for a moment longer, his gaze steady, measuring something I could not fully see yet, and then he spoke again, quieter this time, but no less precise. "You will find that everything here has structure," he said. "Expectations. Boundaries." I held his gaze, letting his words settle before I answered, because this was the moment that mattered more than anything that had happened so far, not the contract, not the ceremony, but this, the first time I had the chance to define how I would exist in his world. "Then I will learn them," I said slowly, deliberately, "and decide which ones apply to me." The silence that followed was brief, but it carried weight, a shift so subtle most people would not notice it, but I felt it clearly, the way his attention sharpened, the way something in his expression stilled, like I had just said something that did not fit into the expectations he had already formed. He did not correct me. He did not challenge me. He simply nodded once, a small movement that felt more significant than it should have, and turned slightly toward the interior of the house. "We will see," he said. And for the first time since this began, I realized that this was no longer just about adapting to his world. It was about how much of it I was willing to accept, and how much I intended to change. The hallway stretched longer than I expected, each step echoing softly against polished floors that reflected just enough light to make everything feel precise, controlled, like even sound had rules here, and as I followed the woman deeper into the house, I became aware of how quiet everything was, not empty, but contained, like the walls themselves absorbed anything unnecessary, leaving only what mattered. She stopped in front of a set of double doors and turned to me with the same composed expression she had worn since the moment I arrived, her hands folded neatly in front of her. "If you need anything, you may call for assistance at any time," she said, her tone respectful but distant, like she was offering a service, not a connection, and then she stepped aside, opening the doors with a smooth motion that revealed a room larger than my entire childhood home. I did not step in immediately. I let my eyes adjust first, taking in the details, the high ceilings, the soft neutral tones, the wide windows that looked out over grounds I could barely see in the dim light, everything arranged with intention, nothing out of place, nothing personal. It was beautiful. And completely unfamiliar. "Will you require anything else this evening, Mrs. Moretti?" she asked, the title landing again with that same quiet weight, and this time, I did not hesitate. "No," I said, my voice steady, "that will be all." She nodded once, as if confirming something unseen, and then she left, the doors closing behind her with a soft finality that left me alone in a space that was now mine, at least in name. I stepped inside slowly, the carpet soft beneath my feet, absorbing the sound of my movement entirely, and for a moment, I simply stood there, letting the silence settle around me, not oppressive, not overwhelming, just present, like a blank page waiting for something to be written on it. My reflection caught in a tall mirror near the far wall, and I moved toward it almost without thinking, drawn by the need to see if I still recognized myself in this new place, in this new role, in this version of my life that had changed so quickly it almost felt unreal. The dress still fit perfectly, the same one I had worn downstairs, the same one that had marked the moment everything shifted, but something about it felt different now, less like something forced onto me and more like something I was choosing how to wear. I studied my expression, the steadiness in my eyes, the absence of panic I would have expected hours ago, and I realized that nothing about this situation had made me weaker. If anything, it had made me sharper. More aware. A quiet knock at the door pulled me from my thoughts, and for a split second, I considered ignoring it, testing the boundaries I had just been told existed, but instead, I turned and crossed the room, opening the door just enough to see who stood on the other side. Victor. He did not step in. He did not need to. His presence filled the doorway as easily as it filled every room he entered, and for a moment, neither of us spoke, the silence between us not uncomfortable, just deliberate, like we were both measuring something that had not yet been defined. "You will find that this house functions efficiently," he said after a moment, his voice low, controlled, "but it is not restrictive unless it needs to be." I leaned slightly against the doorframe, not closing the distance, not inviting him in, just holding my position as I considered his words. "And who decides when it needs to be?" I asked, my tone calm, not confrontational, but not passive either. His gaze held mine, steady, unreadable, and for a second, I thought he might deflect, might give me the kind of answer that sounded complete without actually saying anything, but instead, he answered directly. "I do," he said. The honesty of it did not surprise me. The clarity did. I nodded once, acknowledging the truth of it without challenging it yet, because this was not the moment to push, not the moment to test how far that control extended. Not yet. "Then I suppose I will learn how often that becomes necessary," I said quietly, and something in his expression shifted again, that same subtle change I had begun to recognize, not irritation, not approval, something more complex, like I had just stepped slightly outside the pattern he expected. He did not respond immediately, and in that pause, I realized something important. He was not used to being questioned in this way. Not directly. Not without hesitation. Finally, he inclined his head slightly, a small acknowledgement that felt more significant than any words he could have chosen. "Rest," he said simply. "Tomorrow will require your attention." He turned then, leaving without waiting for a response, his footsteps fading into the quiet structure of the house, and as I closed the door again, the silence returned, but it felt different now, less empty, more intentional. I moved back into the room, my gaze drifting once more to the reflection waiting for me, and this time, I did not question what I saw. I understood it. This place had structure. It had rules. It had control. But so did I. And if Victor Moretti believed he had brought someone into his world who would simply adapt to it, he was about to learn that adaptation was not the same as surrender. The house did not sleep the way normal places did. I realized that before I even opened my eyes, because the silence was too complete, too controlled, like every sound had been filtered before it reached me, and when I finally sat up in the unfamiliar bed, the soft light already spilling through the tall windows told me morning had arrived without asking whether I was ready for it. For a moment, I stayed still, letting the reality settle again, not as a shock this time, but as something steady, something I could examine instead of react to, and I took a slow breath, grounding myself in the quiet certainty that nothing from yesterday had been undone overnight. I was still here. Still in his world. Still in control of how I would exist inside it. I moved carefully, noticing how everything in the room had been arranged with precision, my clothes already placed neatly. On a chair, a tray set by the window with coffee that was still warm, as if someone had anticipated the exact moment I would wake, and that realization alone told me more about this house than any explanation could. Nothing here was random. Everything was observed. Everything was managed. I stepped closer to the window, wrapping my fingers lightly around the edge of the curtain and pulling it back just enough to see the grounds below, the long stretch of green, the distant gate I had passed through the night before, and beyond that, a world that now felt further away than it actually was. "Good morning, Mrs. Moretti." The voice came from behind me, calm and respectful, and I turned to find the same woman from the night before standing just inside the door, her presence quiet but intentional, as if she had been waiting for the right moment to enter. "Mr. Moretti has requested your presence for breakfast," she continued, her tone steady, like this was not an invitation, but not quite an order either, something in between that left just enough room for interpretation. I nodded once, setting the curtain back into place. "I will be ready shortly," I said, my voice even, and she inclined her head before leaving again, the door closing softly behind her, leaving me alone with a choice that felt smaller than the ones I had made yesterday, but no less important. I dressed without rushing, selecting the simplest option from what had been provided, something neutral, something that did not try to define me before I had the chance to define myself, and when I stepped out into the hallway, the same quiet order greeted me, the same sense that everything here moved according to a structure I had not yet fully seen. The dining room was exactly where I expected it to be, large but not overwhelming, the table set with precise symmetry, sunlight filtering in through tall windows that made everything look softer than it probably was, and at the far end, Victor was already seated, his posture composed, his attention resting on something in front of him that he set aside the moment I entered. He did not stand. He did not need to. His acknowledgement was subtle, a slight shift of his gaze, but it was enough to mark my arrival. "You are punctual," he said, his voice calm, measured, like he was noting a fact rather than offering approval. I moved to the seat across from him, not waiting to be directed, not hesitating, just choosing, and as I sat down, I met his gaze directly, the same way I had the night before, the same way I intended to continue. "I was told you were expecting me," I replied, and for a brief moment, something almost like a reaction crossed his expression, not visible enough for anyone else to notice, but I saw it, the slight adjustment, the quiet recalibration. A server approached silently, placing a cup of coffee in front of me, and I wrapped my fingers around it without breaking eye contact, letting the warmth settle into my hands, grounding me again in the present moment. "This house operates on efficiency," Victor said after a pause, his tone unchanged, but his attention sharper now, more focused. "Expectations are met without delay." I took a small sip of the coffee, letting the silence stretch just long enough to show that I was considering his words, not reacting to them. "Then I will make sure my expectations are just as clear," I said, setting the cup down gently, and this time, the shift was undeniable, not in his posture, not in his voice, but in the way his eyes held mine a fraction longer than before, like something about this conversation had moved beyond what he had planned. The room remained quiet, the morning light steady, everything around us functioning exactly as it should, but beneath that surface, something had changed, something subtle but real, because this was no longer just about me learning his world. This was about him realizing that I was not here to be absorbed by it. I was here to shape it. The silence at the table did not feel empty anymore, it felt deliberate, like every word that had not been spoken carried as much weight as the ones that had, and as I set my cup down, I could feel his attention sharpen again, not in a way that demanded control, but in a way that suggested recalculation, like he was adjusting something in real time, something he had assumed would be simple. Victor leaned back slightly in his chair, his movements controlled, economical, nothing wasted, and for a brief moment, he did not speak, he just watched me, as if the conversation we had started was no longer about rules or expectations, but about understanding something less predictable. "You speak as if you have authority here," he said finally, his voice low, steady, not confrontational, but not dismissive either, like he was testing the weight of my words rather than rejecting them. I did not look away. I did not soften. I let the statement settle between us before answering, because this was not about reacting, it was about choosing the exact moment to respond. "I speak as if I intend to have it," I said, my tone even, controlled, and for the first time since I had entered this house, I saw something unmistakable in his expression, not surprise, not irritation, but interest, sharp and focused, like a line had just been drawn where none had existed before. The room remained quiet, the staff moving in and out with practiced precision, placing dishes, removing them, maintaining the illusion that this was a normal breakfast, but beneath that surface, something had shifted, something neither of us could ignore now. Victor reached for his coffee, taking a slow sip without breaking eye contact, a deliberate pause that gave him time to consider, to measure, to decide how he would respond to something he had not planned for. Authority is not something that is declared, he said after a moment, setting the cup down with the same quiet precision. It is recognized. I felt the weight of that statement, the truth in it, the challenge in it, and instead of pushing against it, I nodded slightly, acknowledging it for what it was. Then I will make sure it is, I replied, my voice steady, and this time, the silence that followed was different, heavier, more defined, like the conversation had crossed into something neither of us could step back from easily. He studied me for a long second, longer than before, like he was searching for hesitation, for uncertainty, for anything that would confirm what he had expected when this arrangement was made, but he did not find it. I knew he did. Not because I did not feel it anymore. You are not what I was told to expect, he said finally, not as an accusation, not as a compliment, just as a fact, and I let a small breath out, almost a quiet acknowledgement of my own. I imagine a lot of people are not, I said, allowing the faintest hint of something lighter into my tone, not humor, not quite, but enough to show that I was not confined to one version of myself. Something shifted again, subtle but undeniable, like a new variable had entered the equation, something that could not be controlled the same way everything else in his world was. Victor leaned forward slightly, resting one hand on the table, his posture still composed, but his attention fully engaged now, no longer observing from a distance, but participating, even if he had not decided what that meant yet. Then we will need to adjust expectations, he said, his voice quieter now, more deliberate, and I felt that statement settle deeper than the others, because it was not just about me anymore. It was about him. About the way he would have to change something in order to account for my presence. I nodded once, not in agreement, not in submission, but in recognition, because this was the first moment that felt balanced, not equal, not yet, but closer than anything before. That would be wise, I said, and this time, I did not miss it, the faint shift at the corner of his mouth, not a smile, but something close enough to suggest that for the first time, this situation was no longer entirely within his control. The conversation did not end there, but it changed, moving into quieter territory, into details about the house, about schedules, about expectations that sounded ordinary on the surface but carried layers beneath them, and I listened, not just to the words, but to the spaces between them, to the way information was given and withheld, to the structure that defined everything here. And as the morning light continued to fill the room, steady and unchanging, I realized something that settled firmly in my mind, something that would shape everything that came next. Victor Moretti had built a world where nothing happened without his knowledge. Where every detail was accounted for, every outcome considered. But he had not accounted for me. And now, for the first time, he was beginning to understand that. The conversation did not end when the plates were cleared, it shifted, quieter now, more deliberate, like both of us understood that whatever had started at that table was not something that could be resolved in a single exchange, and as I stood, the chair sliding back with a soft, controlled sound, I felt his attention follow me, not in a way that stopped me, but in a way that measured what I would do next. "Walk with me," Victor said, his voice calm, not commanding, but not optional either, and for a brief moment, I considered refusing, testing that boundary directly, but instead, I nodded once and moved toward the open doors that led out to the terrace, because sometimes control was not about resistance, it was about choosing when to engage. The air outside was cooler than before, the morning still settling into itself, sunlight stretching across the stone beneath our feet, and I stepped out beside him, aware of the space between us, not distant, not close, just intentional, like everything else in his world. He did not speak immediately. He let the silence sit, the same way he had at the table, the same way he had in the car, like he understood the value of what was not said, and when he finally did, his tone had shifted, not softer, but more direct. "You are adjusting faster than expected," he said, his gaze moving briefly across the grounds before returning to me, and I could hear it now, not just observation, but something closer to acknowledgement. I leaned lightly against the stone railing, letting my fingers rest against the cool surface, grounding myself in the moment before I answered. "I do not see the benefit in falling behind," I replied, my voice steady, and he watched me again, that same careful focus, like he was recalibrating with every word I chose. "Most people would take time," he said, and I let a small breath out, something almost reflective, not defensive. "Most people were not prepared for this before it happened," I said, and that was the closest I had come to revealing. Anything personal, anything beyond the surface I had maintained, but I did not elaborate, because not everything needed to be explained to be understood. He caught it anyway. I could tell by the way his expression shifted, not visibly, not dramatically, but enough that I knew he had recognized the difference. "You anticipated something like this," he said, more statement than question, and I turned my head slightly, meeting his gaze fully again, because this was where the line sharpened. "I anticipated being placed in situations where I would not be asked what I wanted," I said, choosing each word carefully, not accusing, not emotional, just true, and for the first time, he did not respond immediately. The pause that followed was longer than any before, not uncomfortable, but significant, like something had landed deeper than expected. The wind moved lightly across the terrace, carrying a quiet stillness with it, and when he finally spoke again, his voice was lower, more deliberate. "And what do you want now?" he asked, and this time, it was unmistakably a question, not a test, not a statement, but a genuine shift in direction, and I felt the weight of it settle in my chest, not heavy, but clear. I did not rush to answer. I let the moment hold, because this was not a question I would answer carelessly. "Clarity," I said finally, my voice calm, grounded. "Not control. Not permission. Just clarity." His eyes held mine, steady, unreadable, but something had changed, I could feel it, the shift from assumption to consideration, from certainty to something more open, more aware. "You will have it," he said after a moment, and the way he said it carried more meaning than the words themselves, because it was not a promise made lightly, not from a man like him. I nodded once, accepting it without pressing further, because this was not the end of anything, it was the beginning of something that neither of us had fully defined yet. The silence returned, but it was different now, not empty, not tense, just present, like a space waiting to be filled with whatever came next, and as I stood there beside him, looking out at a world that felt both distant and closer than ever, I understood something with a clarity that had not been there before. This was not a story about being forced into someone else's life. This was a story about what happens when someone refuses to disappear inside it. And whether Victor Moretti realized it yet or not, he had not just brought me into his world. He had given me a place to change it.